Hey, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And this now is our 10th and last video in our look at content from Chapter 9. And as you can see, it's a look at Decision Making Part 3. So, you may recall from the previous video that we were giving an overview or an outline at the proposed or suggested sequence of rational decision making. And here it is, a slide just to refresh your memory. What we really proposed was that ideally leaders would make rational decisions by following these 6 steps. You see them outlined before you, right? By recognizing and defining the decision situation, by identifying possible options and alternatives, how to proceed, by evaluating each of those alternatives in terms of pros and cons, costs associated, how easy it would be to implement, etc. And from all of those contemplations, step 4, they would select the best alternative of the options that they were contemplating, execute on that in step 5 by implementing the chosen alternative, and then finally, step 6, following up, evaluating the results, making adjustments, making next steps if possible, and really sort of closing the loop on this rational decision-making process. And in an ideal world, this is exactly how leaders would generally behave. However, for anyone who's worked for any amount of time in business, you realize that in the real world, all sorts of things get in the way. There are all sorts of reasons why actual women and men don't 100% follow this rational decision-making sequence. And that's what we're really looking at in this video. So we call them behavioral aspects of decision-making, as you can see from this slide. One of the first of them is a coalition, which the textbook defines as an informal alliance of individuals or groups formed to achieve a common goal. And typically, the common goal is finding preferred decision alternatives. And sometimes this can work to your advantage, that 2 heads are better than 1, that you get a wealth of knowledge, and those kinds of things together, you're able to pool resources and come up with better options and alternatives than if simply one person had been brainstorming trying to solve this problem. And that is very true in some circumstances. However, there are other circumstances where having more folks in the room leads to all sorts of undesired or at least questionable results, like groupthink, like no one wanting to say no to the president of the or CEO of the corporation, like getting a lot of naysayers who, even though you really do have one of your options is the best preferred decision alternative, for political reasons, or they don't like a certain person, or it's going to affect their budget, that together the group moves in another direction. Simply having more voices in the room, it may provide better decision alternatives, but just realize that group behavior may influence the decision on all sorts of ways, that some of which may not be desirable. A second behavioral aspect of decision making is intuition, which the textbook describes as an innate belief about something, often without conscious consideration. All of us have a sense of intuition. Some of us lead with that sense of intuition to make decisions in ways that might short circuit or give short shrift to extended, rational, logical consideration of the alternatives. And I think you know what this can look like. Intuition can look like, oh, I'm just going to go with this decision because I feel in my gut it's the right thing to do. And my question to you is, when did your gut get involved in the decision? Was your gut informed of the latest data? Was your gut informed of global statistical information? Was your gut informed of the historical pattern of folks in this particular decision when they make this particular path of action, what generally statistically has been the outcomes 78% of the time over the last 10 years? I mean, these are all the kinds of things that sometimes intuition short circuits or depreciates and doesn't really give full consideration to. Now, There's another side to that, of course, and that is that many times this is exactly what you're looking for when you hire the person who has the most amount of industry experience. Is that sometimes intuition leads wise, experienced leaders to make the right call, even though they can't necessarily articulate in words and details why it's the right call. And sometimes it comes down to this sort of flustered explanation that says, hey, just trust me, I'm sure this is the right move. Sometimes it actually is the right move, even though the person can't fully explain it. So it's a two-edged sword, this whole idea of intuition. At times it can be a wonderful, valuable, priceless tool, and at other times it can really lead us astray into territory that more objective, rational contemplation might have steered us away from. Again, behavioral aspects of decision-making. This next slide gives us 3 more to contemplate. A very accurate behavioral aspect of decision-making, a very accurate term, known as escalation of commitment. And that is defined by the text as staying committed to a continued course of action even after it appears to have been wrong. What does this look like? In the real world, escalation of commitment can look like this. At the beginning of the fiscal year, the leader of a particular department or division says, hey, I think that we should just pursue this. We should really throw our money behind product line number 2. I have the sense, and I've got some data to back it up, that no one else is really dealing with this particular type of solution. None of our competitors have anything like it. This is going to be, over the next 12 months, really the barn burner in our industry. I'm telling you, this is where we ought to put our chips behind. And quite frankly, some of your other leaders, your co-managers, your peers say, I'm not so sure, John. That sounds like not only kind of risky, but I'm not really sure that any of the data you've had really proves that this is the way to go. And I know your intuition, but you know what? I think there's a better way for us to really deploy our resources and put everything behind product number 2. So what happens? You decide to go for it anyway, no matter what your other managers, your peers sort of shared with you. You're going to do this thing, and you know what? Darn it, I'm going to prove them wrong. And March rolls around. It's now March of the year, the end of the first quarter, and things have not been turning out the way that you thought product number 2 would go. But you know what? If in April you pull the plug, some of your other peers are going to say, I told you so. Look, you wasted 3 months. And so part of your pride and your ego says, I'm going to prove them wrong. I'm going to stay the course. And really the problem is not that we took this course of action. The problem is we just didn't have enough resources in the marketplace. So we're going to increase our budget by 25%. We're going to push hard. I'm going to push my people even harder. Okay, let's see if that works. And then, April, May, end of June, and things really haven't gotten good. And at the halfway mark, some of your managers are coming up to saying, hey, do you think maybe you might want to think about taking your foot off the gas on product number 2? Doesn't seem to be working out for you or for any of us, quite frankly. And by then, every mention of that kind of naysaying, it just gets the hackles going up on the back of your neck. And you get my point, right? Why do managers go after escalation of commitment? For the very same reason that some of you have gone to Reno or Vegas to gamble. And if you've gone gambling, just think in your mind, has anyone ever lost $500 gambling? Maybe perhaps some of us in this class have lost $500 gambling, either at Vegas or at Reno or someplace, Atlantic City. And I guess my question to you would be, why'd you lose $500? Why didn't you stop when you'd lost $30? And of course, the answer. The answer is escalation of commitment. Because after you lost $30, you thought, you know what, I can just pull this around. I'm just, if I just focus a little better, I'll get back that 30. And maybe you did. And not only that, but then you were up 100. Right? And thought, man, I can do no wrong. This is working for me. I might be on TV someday, right? And then all of a sudden you're up 150 and then you're down 30 and then you're down 100. You get my point, right? The kind of stay the course attitude that causes us to not lose 30 but lose 500 or more than that gambling is really the same kind of behavioral aspect in decision making, why it becomes difficult for leaders to walk away from a particular path of action, even when it seems like there's some voices both outside and inside your head saying maybe the smart thing is to, walk this one backwards, lick our wounds, and live again to fight another day. Well, that's the first on this slide. And there are two other behavioral aspects of decision making. I'm giving you two there. The one in the middle there, satisficing, is not in this particular textbook, but it's in some other textbooks I've used to teach on decision making before. I thought I would give it to you anyway. So what is satisficing? Satisficing is the temptation to take the very first option that meets all your gatekeeper criteria. What do I mean by that, by gatekeeper criteria? Well, as you know, when we laid out the rational decision-making model, the first step is to recognize and identify what is the decision situation in the first place, right? But then the second step is to identify all of the possible options and alternatives, right? Now, the way that you generally identify possible options and alternatives is by sort of laying out what the constraints are, right? In business, what does that mean? Typically, it can include the maximum amount of budget you have to spend towards this problem, as well as what are the available resources, human resources, physical, financial resource. What are all the resources you have to address, to throw at this particular problem or situation that you've got brewing, right? And you may have some other time constraints as well. It's all got to be done within 2 months, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so many times what you'll do after you've laid out all of the criteria that you have to meet, what does that mean? It means even if you have 15 different options, every single one of those options, in order to move forward, they have to meet all 15 of these criteria. Does this make sense? Well, here's the deal. Once you start evaluating each of those options, you're going to quickly find that, well, option number 1 sounds really good, but it doesn't meet the last 3 criteria I gotta have. So I go to option number 2, and option number 2, man, it strikes all these boxes except for criteria number 3, and you know what? I just am not willing to live with it unless I get criteria number 3 met. And so you start working your way down all of these possible options, and you get to the point, because your time is short, you have other things you need to be doing than just solving this problem, you're just going to get so weary, exhausted, and impatient that the very first option that meets all the criteria that you have in your mind, I'm just going with that. I'm just going with that because I got things I got to do. I got people to see, I got just other stuff I got to attend to. If it meets all the criteria, then by definition, it's the right option, and bang, I'm all in. But is it the right option simply because it's the first one to meet all the criteria? Well, I think you already know the answer to that. You don't really know. You don't really know. And quite frankly, if you only have one option, are you really making a decision, right? Or should you keep pressing on in your consideration and evaluation until you at least have a couple of different options to choose from? Right, so you see the danger of satisficing in that sort of elaboration. And finally, the last one on this slide, which is a behavioral aspect of decision making, and it's not really a danger, it's not right or wrong per se, but it's simply what is the innate risk propensity that a person, a decision maker, brings to the decision. You see the definition there. The extent to which a decision maker is willing to gamble, willing to risk when making a decision. Again, even if you just take the easy example of who's ever lost $500 in Vegas, right? Some of you would say, well, I've never really gambled, but quite frankly, I would never lose $500 in Vegas because $500 is too much money to gamble in the first place. I find my own value, my own money that I'm earning with the sweat of my brow to be too valuable to throw it on a green felt table and just kiss it goodbye. I would never risk that much. Well, you see that there are different levels of risk propensity, and that in and of itself is going to affect how effective some folks are in decision making. If you have a decision to be made in front of you that involves high degrees of risk to not only yourself but your entire company, and you are already someone who is very risk averse, who doesn't like contemplating high levels of risk, no matter what the possible return, then that will affect the decisions you make just as well as any of these other behavioral aspects of decision making. I hope that makes sense. This is then just an introduction, really, to the whole topic of decision making in leadership. Some fascinating things to contemplate, some things to keep in mind even as you are put in positions to make decisions in business for the sake of your organization with greater and greater levels of possible consequences. Things to keep in mind. And so I hope that this has been helpful. This concludes our look at the content from Chapter 9. We'll see you in the next module.